Welcome to River Talks. This is our online interview version of River Talks. I'm Catherine Price, the River Talks program manager, and today we're excited to host a team of people here as part of our interview, and these are all students from Vanderbilt University. As part of a final project, we worked with this awesome group along with a few others to develop an in-stream tool to help collect surface level litter. If you've ever seen or heard of the Mr. Trash Wheel, that is pretty famous. It's a little bit similar to that concept, but we'll talk a lot about some of the key differences between the approach that these students took and that approach. We also have Ross Miller on the line. He is our Clean Streams coordinator who has been working with this group of students. So today we've got 3 mechanical engineering students. We've got Eric Shanahan, Mathew MacDonald, and Serena Hostetter. And then we've got Sam Rowland, who's a civil engineering student. So this group, along with a few other students, helped to bring this project together. So just to kick it off, would you guys be able to describe your project and what you all were working on?
Sure, I'm going to take this question for us. So as you kind of described a little bit, we were working on building what we called a stream litter collector. And the point of this project was to design a device that could collect surface level trash. And we were working specifically in Mill Creek. Ross told us that a lot of trash has been washing in off the roads and been feeding into Mill Creek from other smaller streams and creeks. So we wanted to try and collect as much of this litter, the surface level litter, as possible before it gets to the Cumberland River. Because once it gets there, it kind of gets filled with water and broken up a little bit and sinks to the bottom and is a lot more difficult to collect once it gets there, and can also lead to the microplastics becoming an issue once they start to break down in there. So we wanted to make this device to collect the surface level litter in Mill Creek, but also create a device that could be recreated and placed in other creeks and streams around Nashville once we got this first prototype sorted out.
Awesome. And could you clarify just again what surface level litter means versus other types of litter that we might find in our streams?
Sure. So we were targeting the kind of stuff that you see floating on the surface. If you've ever been out to these waterways, you may have seen it. It's mostly water bottles, plastic bags. Sometimes it can get into a little bit larger stuff, but just kind of stuff that you would expect people to kind of like throw out their car window that would end up in the streams and be floating down, and that is visible.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, because we talk a lot about that litter that ends up kind of embedded in the stream bank. During cleanups, a lot of times it's better almost to keep that stuff in, because when you start pulling stuff out, you end up with a lot of sediment and erosion. And so it's obviously still an issue, but that surface level litter is easier to clean up before it ends up kind of embedded into those waterways. And so I know you guys worked a lot with Ross and learning about litter. Was this a topic that interested you before? And how did you all kind of come together and feel like this was the topic you wanted to take on for your final project?
Yeah, so the way that Vanderbilt sets up the mechanical engineering senior design program is that we didn't choose each other as a team, we all chose the topic. So we all individually found this project really interesting, and since we all ranked this as our top choice, we were put together to work on it. I know for me personally, the reason that I chose this is because I care a lot about the environment. I'm actually trying to go into environmental engineering, so it seemed like a really cool opportunity to put together all of the skills that I've learned over the past few years to help better the environment in our local community. And it was also just a really fun design challenge because there were so many different factors that we had to take into account. Like our design from the first day to the last day are completely different. So yeah, it was just a really fun project, which is what drew me into it and had a lot of obvious benefits to the community, which I really liked.
Awesome. Well, we're excited that you guys were willing to take this project on. So you talked a little bit, Serena, about some of the challenges that you guys experienced along the way. Do you guys want to talk about some of the interesting things that you kind of had to deal with as you were developing this? And I know we don't really have a visual of what this looks like, but if you could describe a little bit about what that tool ended up looking like.
Sure. Yeah. So it's basically, if you can imagine, just a long set of 2 parallel rails that are, I mean, for our device that we put in Mill Creek, that was 24 feet long. And so that's basically going along the entirety of the bank, and it's anchored at a point that is out of the water. And on those rails is an arm that is really easily able to kind of slide up and down, and that arm just floats on the surface of the water. And that's a design we came up with because one of the biggest requirements that we had to deal with was the really large change in water level that we not only saw at Mill Creek, but a lot of other creeks around Nashville. And so this rail sliding system basically allows for that arm to move up and down on that surface of the water for any water level, whether it's flooding or it's all the way down and it's a little bit drier. And yeah, some of the biggest challenges, like Serena had just mentioned, were the changing environment of everything. And one day could be an entirely different environment for this system than the next day, all depending on the weather and Mother Nature. And that's an exciting thing to get to work with. And so that's something that was really exciting to work with. But another thing that we learned a lot about, and something that you don't necessarily get in kind of your technical degree and learning about it, is designing for production and designing for kind of scalability, so that this device and this idea can not only work in the creek that we were originally looking at, but it can also work in a bunch of different creeks all over the place, depending on the size, the water level change, things like that. And so a lot of what this project was for us was learning how to make it as modular as possible, so that you can break it down and make it really small or really big based on whatever application you need. And additionally, kind of taking our design and being able to, make it as recreatable as possible. So reducing the amount of parts that you need to get custom made. And so trying to make it as, off the shelf as possible, basically, so that you can basically just get this parts list and get everything online or at Home Depot, whatever, and put it together without a ton of kind of machining work or things like that. So a lot of this project, and I think some of the coolest things we learned, were in that aspect, whereas kind of not only the design process, but also making it as repeatable as possible.
Yeah. And I know that those changing conditions were a big deal. I know that at one point the device was completely flooded under the creek because it had rained so much, and you all were like, can't do anything right now, it's out there. And so I think that kind of real world application is obviously really key. And in these techniques, we see things like the Mr. Trash Wheel, and they look so cool. But then when you start to realize all these factors about how much Mill Creek in particular fluctuates up and down, it makes it really difficult to implement it. So would you say that was the most difficult part of this project, was sort of dealing with how that actual environment works?
Yeah, I think because most engineering projects or problems, things like that, you have, your set environment with set dimensions, and the river, not only like due to erosion just from the water, the cross section of the river looks different any given day. The height of the water changes, the width of the river changes.
Yeah.
So, and again, like you said, with that flooding that we had to deal with one of our tests, it was exciting and definitely difficult, but it helped us, and we learned a lot from it. So yeah, definitely that changing environment was probably the biggest difficulty that we had with this.
Yeah. Well, it's exciting that you guys got to kind of work through some of those challenges as well. Obviously, very real world application. So I know you worked a lot with Ross, who's been thinking about this type of device for a long time. So I know he kind of wanted to see what you all were thinking about as this device moved forward.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of say how it was neat. This track system they went with was how different it is from this Mr. Trash Wheelie, which is just set up in the Baltimore, the harbor, where the flow of water, of course, is much, much different than on Mill Creek or anywhere here in the Cumberland, where we're going to have, like they were saying, the change in the tides with the amount of storm we get, especially as much rain we got here in the early spring, late winter. So what I was most impressed about was how they took their sessions with Gary from KCI, who served as kind of an advisor on this project, and they tweaked every time we saw them. They tweaked their projects, and you guys could kind of talk about the design changes. Initially, there was that bucket idea, and you can go on to talk about how that kind of gravity flow would kind of work, and then you ended up on this track system, and to see the growth throughout the months of that was very impressive, and it's cool to see where everybody's mind was going. This whole team was, as Catherine said earlier, a group of different engineers from different spectrums. So it was cool to see how all of your previous experience and all your tastes and your ideas kind of formed this one device. So would you want to go over how you kind of went from the initial design of that bucket to this, to the final design?
Sure. Yeah. So that bucket system, our very, very first design was looking at something called the sea bin, and it's actually really popular out in the ocean. And it's a powered device that's basically, just picture a large trash bin with a net in it with a pump on the bottom, and it just sucks water through it. And so as the water goes through, any trash that might be in that water gets sucked in with it and just gets caught in the net, where the rest of the water just goes out the bottom. Um, and that obviously is really simple, no kind of mechanically intricate parts, and it's relatively easy to recreate, and it can float on the surface of the water, so it can change with water level. And that's all something, that we were really excited about. Those were a lot of the requirements that we had to meet. The biggest problem with that, though, was that it had to be powered. And for our system, there's trees everywhere, at least in Mill Creek, so kind of solar power and things like that were a little bit out of the question, and we couldn't run a big extension cord over there. So we were excited about that idea, some aspects of it, but the active side of it we kind of had to move away from. And like you had mentioned, the Mr. Trash Wheel, that design it does have solar power, but it's mostly powered by just the current of the river that it's in, and it has a water wheel on it, and so that current turns that water wheel, generates power for the device. And that's something that we also looked into. That was another one of our original designs, was making a little bit of the same idea, a water wheel to power our actual device. And the biggest problem we ran into with that was the inconsistency of the flow rates of the water. And so obviously, after a big rain event, while it's flooding, the water is going to be going really fast. We're going to generate a lot of power. But there's no great way, other than batteries, and batteries would have worked relatively well, but there was no great way to store all of that energy that would have been created, during those high flow scenarios to then use for when the water is barely moving, or even in backflow, which that stream can be sometimes. So those self-powered / active devices we chose to move away from, just because there are a lot of different scenarios, and it was hard to be confident that it would work all the time, which is what we wanted it to be. So we got to the track idea because when we first went to the river and we first kind of looked at it, and you hear like an 8 to 10 foot change in water height, and that sounds like a lot, but it's hard to really visualize. And then you go there and you see the differences before and after it rains, and it's like, whoa, okay, we need to reevaluate. And kind of the biggest design challenge then we realized was we need to be able to mitigate this change in water height. And so we had a bunch of different options with that, and we did some prototyping to figure out what would be the best. And we went with this track system because, again, it's simple, it's completely passive, you don't need to power it at all, and again, it can work in any of those water heights, which is something that we were looking for. So it was a lot of different iterations. It kind of started with the collection area, and then once we really got more experience with that stream, we moved towards the actual like arm, which is going to be what is actually collecting that trash, and moving it into a central location for it to be picked up. And we realized that that arm was kind of a bigger priority with that changing water level. So that's kind of the path that we took to get there. It wasn't planned at all. We kind of started off wanting to hit the ground running with a bunch of different ideas, and we did a bunch of different research, kind of the things that I just talked about. And so we basically took all of these ideas and pick and chose kind of the different parts of them that worked best for our specific application. And then from there, like I said before, kind of tried to make it as universal as possible after we kind of got that initial idea.
And one discovery that we had that ended up making our current system work out well, which we didn't realize it was going to in the first place, is one of the big things that we had to work around in Mill Creek is the fact that a lot of people use it for recreation, people kayak and things like that. So we originally thought that a system that had a long arm that extended into the water wasn't going to work very well, because either it has to stick all the way across to collect all the trash and then the kayakers can't go by, or you only have it cover part of the stream, and we thought that that wouldn't be very effective. But one really cool thing that we realized throughout the course of the project with going down to the different streams is that if you place the device on a stream where there's a slight bend, it doesn't have to be anything crazy, but like streams weave around a little bit. And if you place the device on the outer curve of one of those bends, almost all of the trash ends up on that curve in like about 1/3 of the width of the river. So we were able to implement an arm system that only takes up 1/3 of the width of the river and still manages to collect almost all of the trash that flows through there. So yeah, so that discovery definitely led the way to our current design, which was really cool.
Yeah, it should be noted the area you guys were working with was tough, not only because of the flow, but also because of the backflow, as previously mentioned, that this creek right there by the mouth by the Cumberland River. And so not just is the water coming, and a lot of water coming through the city out dumping into Cumberland. Also, when there's a heavy amount of rain coming, backflow will get in there. We use this spot as an actually adopted section by Cumberland River Kayak in our Adopt Streams program. And it's heavily polluted. And that's actually why we came up with this spot. It's actually owned by the Wesnowskis, which are good friends of the compact. And so you guys got to test it out, and as you were saying, and somewhere where with the water level changes so much, there was it was a great spot to test, and also probably the hardest spot to do your first test as well. You were thrown in without a life jacket. And to end up with the design you guys got was phenomenal. If the school year wasn't ending right here and this project was not ending right now, what would you think the next steps would be that you would like to see, to go forward? What would you be doing next?
So as kind of mentioned before, our first testing did not go exactly how we intended it to go. It did end up probably about 10 feet underwater. So that was tough, but we did get to learn a lot of positives from that, one of which being that our anchoring system is very effective. The device was still there when the water level went down, and even with the high flow rates, it didn't get washed away or anything. So that was really exciting to go back out there when the water level was down and it was like still sitting there and still floating. So like Serena said, we learned that a lot of the trash flows along the bank because the faster flow rate on the outside of the curves. So our next steps would have been to kind of tweak the device a little bit, put kind of a like a backboard almost on the arm to kind of collect more litter and place it in an area on that outside curve where we were for our first test we couldn't access that outside bend, so we were hoping to be able to get into a place where we could actually put our collection arm into the bend and see if we could get it to actually collect some trash this time and not get flooded, and then also potentially test it in some other creeks to see how it worked in a smaller area with less flow and different shapes of banks to see how versatile the system is.
Yeah, another thing that we had considered adding if we had the rest of the semester, I think it was Eric who was working on prototyping some potential options for easier removal of the trash out of the collection bin. Because right now all of the trash accumulates into one little collection bin area on the side of the bank, and it's not too bad to scoop out. It's all in one section and near where you're standing, but we thought that it would be nice to incorporate something, maybe a pulley system, where we could just pull the whole collection bin out of the water in case the device was attached to a steep bank where it was a little bit harder to access that trash. So that's one improvement that we were considering making also if we had more time.
Yeah, like Serena said, the current way that we anticipate pulling the trash out is at the end of the arm, there's a little metal collection bin area where the trash is supposed to rest and settle. And the way we would get it out is sort of like a pool net type of system, because if the water level is lower during not a storm, then the railing might not be at the very bottom of or might not be that close to the end of the water where you can stand. So you use a longer pool net to reach down and scoop out the trash from the bin. But like she said, like that might not always be the most accessible or easiest to access. So we wanted to look at adding that pulley system that she had mentioned, or some way to raise the collection area out of the water without actually removing the whole system from the water.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure if you guys had more time, all these great innovations would come to light. So do you see this type of device, now that you've sort of seen how all those environmental conditions vary, all the kind of things you have to consider, do you think that this type of device is a really effective solution to start to look at for collecting surface litter on streams, or do you feel like there's more things that need to be done before this can be more broadly implemented?
I think yes, and I think we can bounce around too as well. But yeah, I think that as far as pure functionality, we've I think learned enough lessons to be confident that you know, and when placed in the right spot in the river, and with like a full understanding of how that area of the river would flood, to make sure that the system is entirely out of that, can't get flooded over, and is in a spot in the river where the trash is most likely to flow through. I think that we've kind of worked out all of the big things of getting the arm in the correct orientation and making sure that we have enough clearances so that the arm can slide up and down easily, even when it's, in a high flow scenario and with all of the sediment that is in rivers and streams like Mill Creek. And so we've gone through with the various tests that we've had, and I mean, beyond testing, kind of analyzing it and looking at the flow rates of the river and the forces and stresses that would put onto our system, and looking at the safety factors and the materials that we use to make sure that everything that we use is strong enough and it'll hold up in that river, and nothing will break in a way that it's not supposed to. So we've pretty much gone through everything that we think is necessary, and so the final step is to just pick the right spot for it, which unfortunately we didn't have quite the right spot, and from there, I think it's once you get that right spot, then it can be implemented in a lot of different ways. In addition to that, kind of like we talked about before, how you can scale it up and scale it down really easily. And so maybe if after further testing, it's not the best thing for a really large river, because as you make that arm longer and longer, it might start to bend more and more. But for smaller streams, we might find that it works even better. So it's all dependent on picking that right spot, like I had mentioned. But I think we're confident that we've gone through the ringer, and we've worked out all of the things that need to be worked out up to the point where it can be an effective system. So I think we all believe in it. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we definitely see a future should it be pursued. So
that's awesome. And Ross, I'm going to toss this back to you. So you're the Clean Streams coordinator. So you're, I know you're out right now doing a litter cleanup on your own. From your point of view, you're out being in these streams and seeing that surface litter pollution. What made you really excited about this project as kind of a next step in, protecting water quality?
Well, I think, my favorite part about Adopt a Streams program is that we get a group of people out there a few times a year to a spot they might not normally be in, a park or in their neighborhood, or just down on some stream, and clean it up 2, 3, 4 times. The only thing about that is it's only being cleaned up 2 or 3 or 4 times, when we know there's more and more trash, specifically plastic, this surface level plastic, washing through there probably daily, or at least every time it rains. So what I'm excited about is like this device, when fit in the right area where it's not going to be flooded or it won't be overkill. I think it could function great on, if there's, I'm right here on the Caney Fork right now. If there's like a feeder creek or feeder stream, a homeowner wanted something like this, if they can go out and, after you figure out how often it needs to be, the trash needs to be taken away from it, that could be over time much more effective, a daily cleaning up, than, and you go and pick it up once a week, versus getting out there every few months. I'm really excited and interested to see as we go further along with this thing, is what the data is showing us on, bags of trash collected a month. And to see how, you know, with the rain season and if it peaks or if it doesn't peak because it's getting washed past it. There's a lot of it, like all the data that's going to come out of this and compare it to our current situation with the adoption program, I'm really excited about.
That's awesome. Do you guys have anything else that you want to add about the project that we didn't talk about? Cool.
I think the only thing I'd like to say is that I think we all had a lot of fun doing this project. Specifically for me being a civil, a lot of the civil projects are large scale things. So you're just kind of designing the project. So this is really exciting for me to get to actually get out in the field and build something and implement it and test it. And so we're grateful to have been given the opportunity to work on this project, and hopefully we were able to come out with something that can be useful in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for taking this project on. Like Ross said, I mean, the challenge of litter and water is such a big challenge, and there's so many ways to enact change, whether it's in, you know, obviously making sure people aren't littering and making sure that litter isn't getting into the stream in the first place, but wait, how can we clean up the litter that's already out there? And it's a big problem. And so I think all these little ways to tackle that problem overall are making a big change. So we really appreciate your effort put into this project, and especially as your semester and year was cut short. So does somebody have anything else they'd like to add before we sign off for today? All right. Well, thank you all again. Really appreciate talking to you all. And we'll share some information in our show notes about the project and some photos and kind of what it looked like, so you can start to see this prototype. And we'll look forward to our next iterations. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.